It's my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Amna. I work for Community Jameel. I'm just going to introduce the panels today as they come in. So we're going to start off with our first keynote with Professor Naren Barfield, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor and Provost of the Royal College of Arts in London. And he will be joined by Brendan McEtrick, who, as you know, is the Creative Director of the Museum of the Future, of Dubai Future Foundation, and is also the founding curator of the Global Grad Show. So please welcome them with me today.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome. So the topic that we're discussing is the role of universities for social development. I'd say that's a broad topic. One thing I will say, though, that as Ellie mentioned, as was previously mentioned, I helped put together the Global Grad Show originally and was the curator for the past few years. And I have to say that that's been a really kind of amazing experience in terms of seeing the impact of universities' potential impact in social development. And that was a process which the RCA, Naren and his colleagues were totally essential to, because when we first had the idea, which was a very, very vague idea, that we would basically bring together some of the projects from graduate shows in from different schools in different parts of the world. That's about all we had. That was 6 years ago. And we had meetings with Naren and his colleagues at the Royal College of Art, and they were very, very supportive of the notion of creating a shared platform, which was basically established with a spirit of fair play and equality, that as many different universities that were doing complementary work could be invited to and participate in. So they volunteered schools in their network. I added some schools in my network, and we cobbled together this little upstart that was at the time just 10 schools and 35 projects. That was 5 years ago. So to see the way it's evolved, and now it's 100 schools, and as Ellie mentioned, 1,200 submissions is really amazing. And also, like I say, I think a testament to the importance of universities, and particularly art and design and technology universities, on the world, and particularly on social issues. Because what I've found making Global Grad Show is that the fact that the designers are young, that the fact that the designers are working in a territory that isn't purely commercial, the fact that they're very often responding to issues which are personal, and motivations which are personal and therefore emotionally charged and have an urgency behind them, and not just kind of filling a niche that somebody in the marketing department identified, gives it much more depth, and obviously makes it much more accessible and fascinating to people who are basically just beginning to be interested in design, or just beginning to try to think about how could I contribute to something which I consider a problem. To say all that, I'm very curious to talk to Naren about your feelings sort of in a powers of 10 way, from the macro to the micro, how you see the RCA for one, but in general, the kind of network, either explicit or kind of wider conceptual network of universities around the world contributing to social development.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. Good morning. I'm very delighted to be here again, and also, as Brendan said, that the RCA has been involved since the beginning of the Global Grad Show, and in fact, as it has got more competitive with so many entrants, lucky to be involved, so very pleased. To look at the macro to the micro about social development, I think a lot of this is perhaps connected with the roles that universities play as forces for social good generally. Of course, they're there to teach students and to undertake research. The core business of a university is to create knowledge and then to disseminate knowledge, and part of that dissemination is through teaching, but increasingly it's through knowledge exchange and working through applying that knowledge in partnership and collaboration and co-creation of knowledge with research users or users of the products of what universities do. And this, I think, is seeing universities developing their mission, adding to the production of graduates who are there for the next generation of workforce and leaders, to thinking a lot more explicitly about how do we engage directly with our constituents, our stakeholders, our industries, and co-create the kind of agendas and futures that we want to be looking at. And that has a real impact on internally the work that universities do, which affects curriculum and the translation of new knowledge into teaching content. And I think we're seeing some radical changes now in how students are experiencing their university education as we talk about things like social development, that not only are students and young people very socially aware and socially engaged, they are, of course, all on social media. They are networked globally. I was very interested, Eleanor mentioned global citizenship. That's a key theme for us, and I think for universities. And a key purpose is to think, how do we support students so that they're not just fit for a job, but they are going to go out and graduate into the world where they're going to provide leadership, awareness, and be part of a global network where they're not simply a lone soul genius designer, but they are working as part of a greater force for social development.
So, in practice, how do you, because this notion, I have to say, the notion that you can't be a lone soul genius, which all of us are really good at not being, is, you kind of, you've been hearing it for a long time, that we need to be more interdisciplinary, we need to develop sort of soft skills that are infinitely transferable and that allow us to kind of stay relevant no matter what. I think there's this particular urgency now because I read the Financial Times had an article not that long ago saying that everyone should anticipate having at least 5 careers in a lifetime. And I think those of us who started off in, like, let's say, journalism or one of these fields that basically just dissolved, know that you do need to somehow figure out a way to stay relevant and stay active. So I'm curious how, in practice, you kind of go about that.
With a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty and challenge, but also listening. So one of the things I think is really important is to listen to what students are telling us. And what they've been telling us for some time is they want more access to work with students in other fields, they want access to other universities, and they want to be able to work directly with industry. So our job is to construct the opportunities around that. So, for example, we now are de-emphasizing the teaching of particular disciplines. There are established disciplines, and you don't get into disciplinarity without having a strong disciplinary base, so I don't want anyone to think I'm diminishing that. But there's a greater emphasis now on starting not at the base of skills and building towards application of skills, but the other way around. Looking at real-world problems, challenges in the world that require multidisciplinary teams to work together, that require skill sets that cannot be found in a single discipline. So designers working with technologists, working with people in artificial intelligence, with medics. We work with medical schools, we work with new material scientists, we work with other universities, with business schools and so on, to address global challenges and global problems and draw those down into the teaching and curriculum. And that's both something that students demand, but it's also something that is, we think, more relevant in addressing real-world problems and challenges. So it's a very difficult thing to do. It's also a difficult thing to do in terms of curriculum design, because if you're trying to deliver a fast-moving education, it's very difficult to translate that from a well-established disciplinary base to taking the risk to punch big holes in that curriculum to say, we're not going to do the standard teaching model, we're going to do a grand challenge. So, for example, we've worked this year with CERN, the European Nuclear Science Research Agency. We've had 600 design students working with 30 physicists, not knowing what on earth would happen. And so you take the risk, but out of that risk comes things that might be more applied design, more public understanding of science, and the benefits that come from putting these different disciplines together. To address your point specifically, Brendan, about career changes, it's at least 7 or 8 changes, if not, I hear 13 or 14 changes. So we can't really focus on teaching students to be ready for a job. What we have to do is think, we're not teaching a designer, a typographer, a graphic designer, and so on. We're actually teaching how to ask questions, how to identify problems, how to work collaboratively, how to build teamwork, and how to assemble the expertise that you need to address the challenges that you're going to face. Because those students are going to be, if they're 25 now, or our average age of students is 27, they're going to be doing jobs in 20 years' time that have not yet been invented. And that's quite a common theme. If we don't know what those jobs are going to be, they're probably going to be, in many cases, inventing the jobs that people are going to be doing. And to do that, we cannot, in a sense, fixate them on a particular skill set. We have to help them to be agile and to be able to change for themselves what it is they're doing. The greatest success is when they no longer need the university. In that sense, I think they can move on and then form their own networks and partnerships. And I think one of the great things that the university does in community terms is provide a platform so that students emerge from that with their own networks already starting.
So the thing is, it's easy to say, and it's correct to say, that we shouldn't be training people for specific professions because you never know whether or not a profession will even be around or be around in any way that people are willing to pay you money to do. But the other problem is that because of the nature of the cost of education, which is ever increasing, there is massive pressure to deliver something of clear value. Mm-hmm. And there's been instances already of, particularly in business schools, students essentially suing their school for not delivering them something that they felt was worth the investment. So how do you navigate that? Because I certainly understand, and I would say I have lived that experience of trying to apply skills in a kind of amorphous way that can be applied in a lot of different environments, but it's very hard to say, yes, I'm a graduate of the Royal College of Art and I'm an expert in amorphous skills.
Yes. I probably wouldn't put the sentence together in quite the way you have.
That's why they asked us to talk to each other.
Yes, which in a sense is not being focused on a tool bag of skills is not quite the same thing as saying it's an amorphous education. I think it's a very specific education, but it's based on real world problems and challenges. So rather than, say, a generation ago, teaching students a course in a particular field, almost every student that we put through the RCA would be engaged in what we call a live project. So they'd be working directly with industry. They'd be mentored by industry. They'd be having what we call a practice mentor scheme so that someone from their chosen profession is able to mentor them through. And they would be working on real world problems and projects that the industry would bring to us. So it's early exposure to the sort of professional challenges that they would have. That is borne out in terms of employability. So we have very high employability rates. And in fact, generally people in creative industries do, because they're very adaptable and they have broad applicable expertise that they can be applied to a wider range of skills and changing circumstances. But having surveyed our students, one of the interesting things is that 50% of them don't want jobs. And that might be a shock. You think you're trying to run a university, are they going to sue us because they don't have a job? But it's actually more reassuring than that. It's not that they don't want to have gainful employment. They just don't want to have a job in the traditional sense of going to work for someone or work in a company. What they want to be doing is setting up their own company, their own business. So at least 50% of our graduates are looking at how do they incubate a business, how do they apply those projects that we've been doing and take that forward into their own company, or how do they work with their fellow students, typically across disciplines. So we have students working from fields as disparate as architecture, product design and fashion, forming companies together to look at agri-tech and pollination as a real world problem. Now, how that would come about, I can't really think of anywhere else other than a kind of an art and design environment where you can put people together with those disparate interests and they apply those interests to a field they probably would not have found in other ways. So I think that's the kind of environment that one creates. There is risk involved, but I think it's always about the curious, creative mind that is able to apply itself in the most agile way.
Yeah, it's a super interesting point, and it's something that we found over and over again with Global Grad Show, that it's, of course, things have changed quite a bit, but I would say the change that seems cruelest to me is that now everyone's expected to be an entrepreneur when they graduate. And you didn't go to school to become an entrepreneur, you came into school to become whatever you went to school for. Yeah. So, I'm curious about how you, and I suppose everybody really now navigates that, because on the one hand, it is a kind of dereliction of duty to not include it, because the reality is that when you come out, everyone expects you to be able to basically represent your work and figure out how to market it. But on the other hand, that's a specific disposition that
Yeah.
for centuries a specific kind of person did, and other
Yeah.
people had other interests. So how do you kind of introduce that without letting it overly influence what should be a kind of non-commercial effort in a lot of ways?
It's, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule per se, but I think it's that the way students are engaged in projects is very much, nothing overrides creativity. The creative imagination is the most important thing, whether someone ends up being an entrepreneur or not. They may actually be quite comfortable working as a less leading light within a group of other people, but there is absolutely a focus on how do you identify the area you want to work in, how do you articulate the problems that you're engaged with, how do you communicate the way you've gone about doing things, the methods that you use. So in a sense, perhaps where in a generation ago or previously the emphasis would have been on acquiring skills, and skills are still very important, the emphasis has shifted from skills towards looking at the application of knowledge and selection and looking at methods. And part of that is to be able to communicate that. So I think whether we give it a grand name like entrepreneurship, or whether we say we're helping to equip people to go out into the world and recognize that there are gaps in knowledge or gaps in human experience, gaps in services, gaps in the way people engage. I mean, if we look at aging as a topic, for example, the world is getting older. If we're fortunate, we will live long lives. The expensive way to deal with aging is to put older people into care homes at great cost to society, and loneliness and other issues. The better way of dealing with it, we think, is to engage with design and design interventions to adapt people's conditions so they can remain independent and mobile for as long as possible later into life. So part of that is skills to do that, but a lot of it is how do they learn to communicate with that community, how do they co-design with that community, and how are they communicating the results of what they're doing. That is a form of entrepreneurship. It may not quite be CEO level in every case, but it's an important part of what people do. So most graduates will not necessarily be heading big companies, although a number of our graduates do. A lot will be working in micro businesses of 4 or 5 people.
I suppose we should have talked about this at the beginning, but how would you define social development?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to define social development. They're probably better experts than I, but I think our approach to looking at social development would be looking at the needs of the world. Every university will approach this differently, of course, and from a different knowledge base and expertise, but for us it's very much that our charter is about being useful. So it's really about, are we doing things that are useful for society, for the economy, and for culture? So we are, of course, creating cultural producers. We're creating people who are socially entrepreneurial, but most of the students themselves will come in with a very strong ethos of social entrepreneurship and wanting to contribute to social development. That will be a wide range of views and perspectives. Also, it's a very international community of some 70 nationalities, so part of the mix is looking at what people bring from their experience and then bring together with others. So social development, for us at least, takes on a very international dimension and looking at challenges that we think we all face. They'll be differentiated by culture, economy and society, but it is about being adaptable to those needs. So I think different universities would probably approach it differently. We're a specialist postgraduate university of art and design. We approach it in the sense of how do we make positive interventions and a difference? And our students will drive that on as well and think, how do they go out? And they have a very strong social ethos to their work. And that's you'd see that in the graduate work, usually in the grad show, but also in the annual degree shows that we have.
So, I mean, no doubt the RCA would interpret it differently than other schools. How do you, think of the university, the academy, as a kind of community member within the larger community of universities, basically?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Go
Yes, yeah, we do very much. Although we're a specialist university, there are universities that specialize in all sorts of different areas, and there are broad-based multidisciplinary universities. We approach that through partnership. We have a very long-standing partnership with, for example, Imperial College London, with engineering, with medicine, with business. We also work with international universities in China, Japan, the US, Singapore. So we approach that as a global citizenship model, and social development then being one of co-identification of expertise, bringing together expertise from different institutions, but then applying that into broader social change agendas. So I think we would look at partnership as being key. We would look at recognizing we cannot do everything, no university can, but we can bring together the best expertise. And a key partner in that is industry, whatever that industry is. It could be the fine art world of galleries, it can be heavy industry in terms of science, tech and AI, or it can be product development, or it can be services. But we also engage very strongly across those areas as well.
And do you allow through those partnerships, does that refine your focus, agenda, kind of vis-a-vis what other people are doing? Like, kind of what I mean is, if you understand that the RCA can't do everything, then do you then sort of seek out partners that are doing something you either can't or would rather not focus on in order to sort of, kind of strengthen what you're doing without having to try to do everything?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, that we would probably not typically partner with a similar institution or organization. We would generally partner with an organization that does something different. And it's the combination of the two that brings that both interdisciplinarity, but also something that is typically, we find often new knowledge is created not only in single areas, but on the overlaps of areas, and you get some of the most exciting developments when these areas come together. So we'd be very comfortable. We run the UK's first design laboratory in a working teaching hospital, for example. We also partner with businesses directly or with business schools. So we look for expertise that we don't have, and we look to see, are there interesting things that we can do together? How does design work with other fields of knowledge?
So that sort of relates to criticism that we've received a lot at Global Grad Show, which is essentially that if you're solely focused on universities, you end up missing a lot of people practitioners who are basically not institutionalized, is the phrase that I heard recently. So how do you address that? Because I will say, like, having made Global Grad Show, I certainly know that there are a tremendous number of places where it's very hard to actually get in touch with a university that wants to participate. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot going on in terms of innovation, in terms of new ideas, good projects, but it is hard within a university system purely to access it or provide a platform for it. So I'm curious about how the RCA or how you approach that social impact beyond the university context itself.
I think it's something we've been consciously trying to address. As I say, if I go back a generation when I was a young teacher starting out, it was a very much more inward-looking world that was about the course of study and the students being fairly contained or siloed within the discipline they chose to study. When I rejoined the RCA 8 years ago, one thing I picked up very quickly was students saying to me, why am I not allowed to ... So it'd be, why am I constrained to only working in this workshop? Why am I not allowed to go and work with students over here? Why are we not allowed to go and work with external organizations? So that's been our lesson, has been to look, how do we facilitate that and make that much more open and available? So I mentioned CERN, but we also work with Logitech, we work with Samsung, we work with a whole range of 60 or 70 companies, we work with non-governmental organizations, and it's all about creating opportunities where students are able to make those bridges. Because we also have to recognize with a sense of humility, we're not there forever. We're there for 2, 3, 4 years for those students, and then they go out into the world. So the best thing we can do is set them up to be active agents, to be designing their own futures. We can't do that for them.
And what about the sort of pre-university members of the community? I mean, I don't just mean relationships with industry, but I mean actually trying to expand the footprint, expand the kind of blast radius of a university as wide as possible, so that people who aren't necessarily, and this is again why Global Grad Show for me has been really satisfying, because a lot of people young people who I think honestly didn't really know what design was, and that design was as applicable as it is, was as curious and as it's potentially important as it is, that it even exists as an option. And I think that it's been really gratifying to see, to be able to provide a way for people to understand that. And even over the years, participating designers have said to me, I wish so much that when I was a kid, I could have gone to Global Grad Show, because you started off in an art school or an engineering program, and you kind of, in a roundabout way, ended up in a design school. So I'm just curious how, particularly from a social impact or social development point of view, the RCA or the community of schools in the UK, let's say, work towards building up awareness and lowering the barriers of entry into this sort of study.
Yeah. It's a really key question at the moment. It's very topical. And I think, just to say, I think our ambition would be that going to an art and design university should be the most exciting thing that anyone can do. It should be everyone's ambition. It should be really, why can't we do this? So I think what you've done in the grad show is a key moment in that, but it's also part of the history of UK art and design education, which, without going into a long explanation, started up really because of the first industrial revolution. The whole art and design education movement was a response to the first industrial revolution. That's why the Royal College of Art was set up, and then all of the 80 or so art and design universities or departments around the UK. So they have a very strong history and connection to their locality, their community, and the need to link that design education to the needs of the industries that they are rooted in. And that's a really important factor of where our origins are. That, I think, got lost. And I think there was then, as art and design colleges became universities, they became quite academicized for a period. And I think we're now in that moment of trying to make sure they're getting out of the ivory tower of the university and are really strongly connected with their communities and industries. So in terms of that pre-university community, it's in a sense even more difficult for the Royal College of Art being postgraduate only, because we're drawing on graduates. So a key part of that is to make sure that we are trying to publicize and promote what we do, but also have a department that is called Reach Out, and it reaches out to school-age children. It engages 15 and 16-year-olds with design and with design opportunities. It also deliberately reaches out to areas where art and design is not thought of, not typical, different constituencies, communities and demographics where perhaps it's not in the family or the kind of the demographic to actually study art and design. So we try and showcase what we're doing there. And to create a lot of short courses, pre-entry courses that will just sow the seeds of opportunity and experimentation, so that some years later someone will think, I really enjoyed that, and that's where I want to be aiming towards. So we will try and make those things possible.
So you mentioned that the sort of origins are with the Industrial Revolution. I know we discussed that the UK just introduced a new industrial policy.
Yep.
So I'm just curious how you read that, how you imagine university, the RCA of course, but other institutions responding to that, and what it says about where we currently are.
I think, again, it's very interesting. The world is changing so fast, and we're now in that moment of the fourth industrial revolution, which is bringing in, and we've had the digital revolution, which was the third industrial revolution. This is now looking at embedded AI, microbiology, nanotech, even digital systems within the human body modification, all sorts of things that could lead anywhere. It's predicted that half of the jobs in the industrial world will disappear over the next generation. So are we going to face a future of mass idleness and unemployment, or are we going to create new types of activity and new application of human ingenuity and creativity? So we're at a very interesting moment where creative universities are having to rethink what the purpose is, and that's why we're looking at how research engages with the real world and how the teaching is built on the back of that. So the UK government has developed an industrial strategy, the first one in 40 years, which is to look at some of these challenges. So it's looking at new ideas, it's looking at new technologies, infrastructure, new business environments, and new places. So it's building, re-engaging with a focus on community engagement as well. And the role of universities is critical in that. You can have the very top-end universities, which mine happens to be one of, which are focused very much on global networks, but it's equally important that you've got regional universities that are focusing on, if they're a coastal university looking at fishing, they're engaged with maritime design, they're engaged with maritime safety and things like that. So each university is having to rethink its purpose and mission as jobs are disappearing very quickly. So part of that is to look at the grand challenges that come along with that. We're looking at artificial intelligence and big data. How's that going to affect the jobs of the future? Clean growth, so how do we move away from a petro or fossil fuel-based economy towards new types of energy and fuel. How do we look at the future of mobility? So we've done something very radical. We've run the world's most successful vehicle design program for 40 years, and we've closed it. And that might seem crazy to close a really successful program, but actually it's just recognizing that in 10 years' time, most governments will have closed down the internal combustion engine. We won't be owning cars in the same way. We'll be traveling in different ways. And so rapidly, universities have to shift their focus towards new types of industrial activity, new types of job, new ways of living.
So actually, how much time do we have? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 8 minutes? I'm just, we could talk forever, but I would love, if anyone has a question or would like to contribute in some way, I'd love to give the opportunity for that. Okay. Yes, ma'am? Do we have a microphone? Do we have a mic? Anyone?
Someone's fetching one. Yeah, there's one.
Okay. Oh, no, wait, one is coming. Thank you for volunteering to be loud, though. That's helpful. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for the conversation. I think all of that's been discussed sort of resonates with us and most universities today, I
So
feel.
maybe introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Srishti Bajaj, and I represent Pearl Academy from India. So one of the questions that I have when looking at social innovation and projects that students do, I think my concern usually comes when it comes to deployment. And how do we train our students to navigate the politics of that? And in a country like India, working with communities, working with government, state level, central level, and you mentioned about soft skills.
Yeah.
I think the designers today really need to figure out a way to be able to have that agency somehow. So any thoughts on that? I don't know, I think I keep wondering, how do we train our students to be able to effectively deploy what they've created? Thank you.
It's a very good question, because I think whenever you start to work on any engagement that goes beyond the university, you are necessarily relinquishing some control over that process. So the best way, I think, is to make sure that the preparatory work between the university and whatever the external organization or governmental agency or NGO is well defined and established. Projects can go wrong, and they often go wrong where there hasn't been enough thought given to the ground rules and the preparatory work that's part of that. So I think that's really important, and it may take some time before students are even involved. I mentioned CERN or any other organization that we work with. It could be 6 months to a year of preparatory work to actually try and work out what it is that relationship is and how it's going to work, and covering as many eventualities as we can. I think the other thing within the university is, as important as it is for someone to be able to design a beautiful typeface, it's now just as important that they learn how to negotiate, how to build up teamwork, how to resolve differences and disputes, how to develop their communication skills, presentation skills, and also increasingly we're hearing language like safeguarding students, creating safer spaces for them to work in, and that also goes when they're working with external agencies as well. But you cannot possibly cover every single eventuality unless you're in a quasi-contractual basis. And that might come at certain stages if we are doing a more consultancy-based approach with an industrial partner, then it will be more legally stipulated. But I think we try not to make it too overbearing so that students are actually engaged on the creative ideas. But that means a lot of preparatory work with the partner that we might work with.
If I can just add a little bit, I think my concern is, I think it's easier to do it when the universities and the faculties are involved. I think my concern is that when a student is out in the industry and outside the ecosystem of a university, how do they continue to navigate those politics? I think for me, how do we train students to be able to do that? That's the question.
I think one of the best ways of training is that we have about 200 permanent faculty, but we have 1,500 visiting lecturers and professors who are actually industrial designers and artists who are working out in the field. And so a significant part of the students' education, preparation and experience is within the university, but engaging with people who are in industry and can make industry introductions, but also help students to prepare to navigate through those industries. So an important part is that unlike perhaps more multi-faculty universities, art and design education is still very much rooted in bringing in expertise from practitioners who are still in industry and will help students to navigate and understand that better. In one sense, students have got to go into that at some point. Do they do it when they graduate, or do you do it before they graduate? And our approach is that as we're postgraduate, and they are usually with 4 or 5 years experience anyway after their undergraduate degree, they've usually got about 75% of our students are coming from a job, not from an undergraduate degree. So they generally have some experience to build on as part of that. I think from perhaps more undergraduate focusing universities, there would be more need to do a more formal process perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
There's a hand up.
Hi. Fred Secret. How important is it for an organization like yours to help governments design the policies that will help all the innovations and the creativity that you're stimulating in your academy? And is it important?
I think it is important. If I'm not sounding cynical, I think the first thing is to help governments not to do harm, not to make really bad judgments and choices. So if I take one of our areas, which is service design, our area of expertise in service design has been quite strongly connected with in the UK, what's called the Number 10 Policy Unit, on developing government approaches to delivering better services to citizens, looking at the end-to-end user experience, joined up government, helping citizens to understand better how they can access what they need from government. So I think it is very important also as we are in such a changing world and government services themselves are changing and policies can change as well, that I think we have a fairly critical role to play in better explaining and articulating. And I can give one very quick example, which is really quite fascinating from our point of view. I took a team for a meeting with the UK's Department for Agriculture. You think, why on earth is a design university engaging there? And they said, we've got the veterinary science, that's excellent, and we've got the farmers. The problem isn't the veterinary science, it's the scientists do not know how to explain and communicate with the farmers on what they need to be doing in veterinary science terms. So we have a risk of outbreak of disease in our livestock because although the science is there, the communication isn't. So we got involved in terms of how do you communicate that science better and how do you engage the end user, which often government's not very good at doing, and how do you talk to the end user and say, how would you like to be communicated with, rather than this is how government communicates with you. And so the goal of that is to actually improve user engagement with the service or the government process that they need to work with. And also to help government itself streamline its processes and come to more efficient ways of communicating. Yeah.
Can I also just add something that design thinking has become this like very present, very monetized concept. But I once talked at an event where this was in the UK, a health organization basically asked different practitioners from different fields to talk about how they used evidence basically in their practice. And they wanted to understand better how, as people working in the health field, they could use the evidence, communicate their work. And so I explained working as a designer and working as a curator, and the thing that they really struck them and they felt was a powerful insight was the notion in design of just kind of iterations and understanding that a failure is not a disaster, and in a way there's a lesson there, and to not set crazy expectations that mean that you can only fail. And I think governments have a tendency to present these silver bullets, and then when it inevitably doesn't work perfectly, apologize and like retroactively try to like either abandon it or fix it in this very clumsy way. And I do think that if designers and design universities and people with genuine understanding of design, not the people who are pretending to understand design, but people who actually understand the process, could communicate to decision makers and leaders that basically everything is a constant iterative process where you're trying things out, you're responding to feedback, you're improving it, you're not being devastated by a failure, but you're learning from it and moving on. I think that's a much healthier way to think about design as it could help decision makers and government than some of the sort of design thinking like cliches that are floating around and that a lot of people are very excited about within the government.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think co-design is a really important factor in that. Working with the constituents. Another example would be malnutrition in hospitals among older patients. No one could work out why that was. We put designers in there talking with the older patients, and it was quite simple. No one had bothered to ask the older patients what they wanted to eat. And so they were getting a bad diet, and they were actually suffering malnutrition. Engaging design as part of that co-design process in conversation and iterative design gradually helps to improve the experience and the service, and funnily enough, reduce cost.
Okay, yeah, I think we have time for one more. Yes, sir?
My name is Norby Salonga, and I'm from the Philippines, De La Salle University. Based on your experience, how do you strike the balance between the trust of the organizations on social engagement and the interest of students in volunteering for social engagement? Because I think that's where the problems on commitment actually lies. So how do you strike that balance?
Okay, so as I understand your question about the interests of the organization we might work with and the interests of students, how do we get that balance right? I think you have some broad principles. Everything we do goes through an ethics process. So we have an ethics committee for research projects, innovation, and PhD degrees. We also have a relatively newer ethics process for students on taught programs. So there's nothing we would be doing that isn't, first of all, reviewed for ethics. Then in our discussions with an organization, we would decide, is this something that is a studio project with students and it's safe to engage students in that, or is it something that actually is more complicated or not appropriate and we might engage faculty with it and not students. So we have to look at those judgments on a case-by-case basis. And then also it may come down to the specific agreements that we develop with any external organization, which can be quite lengthy. So what we've had to do that is build up new posts, new roles, new people, new expertise to look at contracts, to look at how do you design the relationship with an external organization, how do you cost that so that it's not doing harm to the students or the university, how do you then look at the ethics dimension so that it is protecting students' interests while giving them opportunities to learn, and often by learning in industry or with an NGO, they will be learning things that the university can't necessarily provide. So it's a good thing to do, but you have to provide all of the parameters and safety checks to make sure it's an environment that you're happy for students to be working in. So ethics is a really important thing, and it's just rising up the agenda very significantly, particularly with artificial intelligence, which has as much power to do harm as it does to do good. And we have to look at those really carefully.
Okay, thank you everybody for listening, and I suppose we'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you.